Today Games Workshop has given us Danger Close Votann style. Let's talk about friendly fire beam weapons and a few other important changes for the Codex. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Leagues of Votann, for whom Games Workshop have just issued an FAQ update document to patch any unintended rules interactions within the Codex. Of course, since their book originally dropped, the Leagues of Votann have had some pretty hefty revisions already. All the points costs went up, and their core Judgement token mechanic got nerfed. This FAQ and Errata document, though, is going to be aimed at patching any obvious issues with the Codex, and usually tries to shy away from making any obvious balance changes. I'd overall say that it probably hasn't made any major difference to the Votann power levels, not compared with their earlier changes, though there are a few interesting clarifications here. Let's talk through the document, what's here and what isn't. First up, this update has basically been added to the FAQ document where they nerfed the Judgement tokens. That was the balance change rule that they got basically as soon as their Codex dropped. Judgement token auto wounds, instead of always counting as 6s, now never count as 6s, breaking some of the very strongest combos in the Codex, like the splash damage railguns, and various other character things like the Brockier Iron Master and all the mortal wounds he could do. It was definitely a solid nerf to keep the book in check a bit. It does seem that they're broadly doing absolutely fine despite this change, though it means that a few of the weapons in the book do have some pretty strange anti-synergy with Judgement tokens. Say for example, Magna Rail weapons actually have less chance of getting splash damage if you happen to have Judgement tokens on the target. In any case, no new changes to this today. It looks like that rules update is here to stay. Next up, and perhaps the biggest news from the update, are all the changes to beam weapons. Technically, I guess Games Workshop is seeing these more as clarifications than rules changes, though I would argue that some of them go directly against the way that the rules are written currently, so maybe they might have been better to do as erratas as opposed to FAQs. Beam weapons are kind of a thing in a few other codexes out there, but it seems to be a particular focus of the Leagues of Votann, having lots of beam weapons such as the conversion beamers on their Thunderkin and land fortresses, or hidden ones within certain units. The way they work is that they score hits on one unit that they target, then they draw a line between the model's base and the closest model of the enemy unit, and hit everything along the way with one hit per hit scored on the target unit. For the most part it was fairly clear, though I feel like there were a few mechanics that just didn't interact super intuitively. I felt like there were gaps in the rules for Games Workshop to patch like this. Perhaps the most interesting and kind of fun change is that beam weapons now do hit friendly units in the way when they fire the beam from one unit to the next. There was some debate as to whether or not they did, as they had the phrase in the rules saying that they hit every eligible target along the way, so it meant that you couldn't snipe characters with Lookout Sir or anything like that. By specifying that it could only hit eligible targets that you could shoot though, it did mean that you sort of couldn't hit your own friendly units, as friendly units aren't normally eligible targets. Now they've basically stated that you do hit friendly units, even though there's nothing to really say that you'd count them as eligible targets though. I can see why they've made this change though, to be honest. It does make a bit more sense, and it fits in with what a lot of the other beam weapons do in 40k. Most of those would hit your own units if you fired through them, so it didn't really make too much sense for Leagues of Votann to have an exception to this one. It kind of makes sense on just an intuitive level as well. If you're going to fire a great big death ray through your own troops, then you're probably going to cause some casualties, if the weapon's supposed to be a weapon that bores through multiple things, I guess. It is maybe just a little bit strange that Leagues of Votann are now one of the easiest armies to shoot your own troops with. Maybe just goes a little bit against their law of actually seeming to value the lives of their warriors, at least far more than the Imperium does. Obviously, most of the time this is going to be a bit of a nerf. Ideally, you don't want to be causing accidental casualties on your own units if you put them in the wrong place, so you would have to bear this in mind whenever you're lining up beam shots on your opponent, but I guess just every so often it might actually be helpful. Say for example, if you had a unit that couldn't fall back for whatever reason, and then you managed to line it up so you'd skewer that and the enemy unit with your beam shot, maybe shooting them out of combat and letting your other units light up the enemies that they were engaged with. Kind of super niche, but it would be quite a cool maneuver to pull if you wanted to, even if the Votann in combat wouldn't thank you for it. It does seem as well though that this might have the slightly unintended consequence of being able to hit your own unit while you're shooting with beam weapons. Say for example, if you had a unit of Thunderkin that were blocked up in a big squad of 6, if you didn't have them in a line or something, you might have one of them towards the back of the squad, who's basically always going to be drawing his line through the own unit. It sounds like from this FAQ you measure from the model to the enemy model, and that maybe just seems a little bit unintended, given that shooting units don't usually affect themselves. Again, could make the positioning of certain units like that just a little bit trickier. Not that Thunderkin with the conversion beamers seem to be particularly great anyway though. Otherwise, there were two more clarifications to beam weapons. First up, that other units hit by the beams don't count as being targeted for the purposes of an attack. That could be relevant for certain things like the Im's beam stratagem. I believe that means that that won't work with the things that are hit by the beam on the way to the target, just the amount of hits on the target itself, and makes that a bit worse really. And they also stated that if your gun has a rule that gives you extra hits on the target, like the conversion beamers do, then it isn't just hits that you score on the target, you also get to make additional wound rolls against everything on the way to the beam as well. Again, that kind of made sense intuitively, but I don't think it was very clearly spelled out, and I feel like it did need an FAQ. Overall, looks like the weapon class has caused maybe a few more headaches for Games Workshop than they might have anticipated, and I feel like this one might be one to address in a further update of the FAQ whenever they get round to it. Maybe just to say about hitting your own units' models, and potentially make a bit of an errata for eligible units, even though their intention does seem to be that it can hit friendlies. Overall though, arguably a small nerf to the leagues of Votann this. If I'm right in thinking that the Im's stratagem is now reduced in potential because of this, then that's not so great for them. And of course, causing casualties on your own units doesn't help either. I must admit, beam weapons don't seem to be super popular within the Codex though. Maybe a few units are kind of good with them, like the Land Fortress. Quite a lot of the rest of them are a bit passable. Might not really affect that many armies all that much. Otherwise, there's just two more FAQs in the document, one for Land Fortress bolt cannons, which was an obvious one from the initial print of the book. They have confirmed in this that each of their bolt cannons shall get 3 shots rather than 2. The datasheet was printed with 2 of them, but the other bolt cannons in the Codex had 3 shots apiece, and that was the same as was included in the War Gear section, I believe. Kind of makes sense, that one. I guess on the raw Land Fortress datasheet, if you're playing it just from that model's rules, then that's a bit of a power boost, an extra 4 shots if you take the cannons. Otherwise, they're just fixing one silly mistake on Uthar the Destined. They hadn't actually listed him as a special character that you can't take multiple copies of. I think to everyone who saw the datasheet it was perfectly clear that he was an individual as opposed to a generic choice that you could spam. Doesn't hurt to absolutely spell that out though, just in case someone wanted to game the system somehow. That's it for the FAQ content. Perhaps the most obvious thing that I'd seen brought up a couple of times before are the Sagitaur Missiles. I feel like this is something that they probably should have FAQs just for clarity if nothing else, as they've made a bit of a misprint in their limited edition version of the Codex, though seemingly fixed it in the updated points values that they listed, plus I believe it isn't an issue in the standalone copy of the Codex that you can buy. Basically, the question is whether or not when you buy the Sagitaur missile launchers, you just get the one profile, either the L7 missile launcher or the Sagitaur one that fires 2 strength 10 shots, or whether you get both profiles together, all included for 10 points. From the limited edition codex, to me it implied that you either got one or the other, the L7 missile launcher being a pretty terrible choice by that comparison. But it does seem that Games Workshop's intends that you get both of them on one loadout. The actual kit comes modelled with 2 different missile launchers, not one. And both in the newer Codex and Games Workshop's FAQ update, they have listed both sets of missiles as coming together for 10 points, so it means that if you choose the missile option for the Sagitaur, then you get 3 scary missile shots, not 2. It definitely makes that loadout a bit more tempting compared with the Matter autocannon version, though I feel like quite a lot of people are probably still just going to want to run them as cheap as possible and not overinvest in the transports. So anyway, that's the rules update for the Leagues of Votann. Let me know what you think down in the comments below. Do you think that the beam weapon changes make sense so they do hit their own units? Potentially even the same unit that's firing the beam attacks if you do have multiple models in the wrong positions. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I'll shortly be releasing a full faction overview of the Leagues of Votann, so feel free to subscribe or check back later if you'd like to see that. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well. You can find that linked down in the video description below if you're interested. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.